In the winter of 1258, the city of Baghdad still believed in its own permanence. For 5 centuries, it had stood as a symbolic heart of the Islamic world, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, seat of scholars, jurists, poets, and astronomers. Though its political authority had faded, its name still carried the gravity of history. Within its walls lived perhaps 500,000 people. Its markets were crowded. Its canals still fed the fields along the Tigris. Its caliph still resided in palaces built by his ancestors. But power, by the mid-13th century, had shifted east. The Mongol Empire, born from the conquest of Genghis Khan in the early 1200s, had become the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. By 1258, it stretched from China to the fringes of Eastern Europe. Its armies had annihilated kingdoms, leveled cities, and redefined warfare itself. In 1251, a new great Khan rose to supremacy, Monk Khan. His vision was not merely expansion, it was completion. The Islamic lands of Persia and Mesopotamia remained fragmented but unbroken. To secure the empire's western frontier, Monk turned to his brother, Hulagu Khan. Hulagu's mission was clear: eliminate resistance in the Islamic world, crush the Ismaili strongholds in Persia, and bring the Abbasid Caliph to submission. By 1256, Hulagu had destroyed the Nizari Ismaili fortresses, including the nearly impregnable Alamut. The psychological effect was profound. If mountain citadels could fall, what hope did open cities possess? Still, Baghdad hesitated. The reigning caliph, Al-Mustasim, inherited an institution rich in symbolism but weakened in military substance. The Abbasid army had shrunk over decades of financial decline and political complacency. Provincial governors acted with growing autonomy. The once feared Turkish slave soldier regiments no longer dominated the battlefield, as they had in earlier centuries. Yet the caliph misjudged the scale of danger approaching him. When Hulagu demanded submission, tribute, and military cooperation, Baghdad responded with diplomatic delay and overconfidence. Advisors around the caliph, some inexperienced, others politically self-interested, assured him that the Mongols would not dare assault the sacred capital of Islam. Some believed internal divisions within the Mongol Empire would stall the campaign. Others relied on faith that God would not allow Baghdad to fall. But Mongol campaigns were not guided by hesitation. Hulagu assembled one of the largest Mongol armies ever deployed in the West. Contemporary sources vary wildly in numbers, but modern estimates suggest perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 troops, including Mongol cavalry, allied contingents from Central Asia, Persian auxiliaries, and engineers from China skilled in siegecraft. This was not a raiding force. It was a calculated instrument of annihilation. By late 1257, Hulagu's columns advanced methodically through Persia toward Mesopotamia. Cities that submitted were spared. Cities that resisted were erased. The message moved faster than the army itself. Baghdad received reports of devastation upstream. Still, the caliph delayed. His decision-making process reveals not recklessness alone, but systemic decay. The Abbasid state had grown accustomed to survival through diplomacy. For decades, threats had been managed through negotiation, shifting alliances, or simple avoidance. The Mongols did not operate within that diplomatic logic. When Baghdad finally began preparations, they were hurried and incomplete. The city's defenses relied heavily on walls originally constructed centuries earlier. Though impressive in scale, they had not been modernized to withstand concentrated siege artillery. The Abbasid military presence inside the city was modest, perhaps 20,000 regular troops at best, alongside hastily gathered volunteers and militias. Worse still, the Abbasid field army was ordered to confront the Mongols outside the city before the walls could even be tested. This was a fatal miscalculation. In January 1258, Hulagu divided his forces strategically. One contingent moved south of Baghdad, crossing the Tigris to cut off retreat and reinforcement routes. Another advanced from the northeast. The city was being enveloped before it fully understood the scale of the encirclement. The Abbasid army marched out to meet them. On open ground north of the city, Mongol cavalry demonstrated the tactical system perfected since the days of Genghis Khan. Feigned retreats, coordinated encirclements, disciplined use of composite bows fired from horseback. The Abbasid troops, lacking cohesion, facing veterans hardened by decades of conquest, broke under pressure. Many were cut down during pursuit. Others drowned attempting to retreat across flooded canals the Mongols had deliberately breached. Within days, Baghdad's external defense collapsed. Now the city stood alone. Hulagu completed the encirclement with clinical precision. Siege engines were assembled from prefabricated components transported across thousands of miles. Chinese engineers supervised the construction of massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones and incendiary projectiles over the walls. Trenches were dug. Supply lines were secured. Patrols ensured no one entered or left. The psychological siege began before the bombardment. From the walls, defenders could see the scale of the army surrounding them, banners stretching across the horizon, disciplined encampments, cavalry patrols riding in silent arcs. This was not a chaotic horde. It was an organized war machine. Inside Baghdad, anxiety spread. The Caliph attempted renewed diplomacy. Messages were sent to Hulagu offering submission, but too late. Mongol warfare relied on uncompromising escalation. Once resistance had been offered and Mongol soldiers killed in battle, mercy became unlikely. Hulagu demanded the Caliph's personal surrender. Al-Mustasim refused. Whether from pride, miscalculation, or fear of internal backlash, the decision sealed Baghdad's fate. The bombardment began in late January. Stones weighing hundreds of kilograms slammed into the outer walls. Defensive towers crumbled. Fires ignited in residential quarters. Mongol archers suppressed defenders attempting repairs. Night offered no relief. Engines continued under torchlight. The Tigris, once Baghdad's lifeline, became a boundary of entrapment. The Mongols manipulated water levels to isolate defensive positions. Engineering, not just cavalry, defined this campaign. Hulagu understood that breaking morale was as critical as breaching stone. Inside the city, leadership fractured. Some officials urged surrender. Others insisted on continued resistance, invoking the city's sacred status. The Caliph hesitated, issuing inconsistent directives. Without unified command, coordination deteriorated. Food supplies, though not yet exhausted, were strained by refugees flooding into inner districts. Rumors spread of entire provinces already subdued. Confidence in divine protection wavered under the relentless percussion of stone against masonry. By early February, sections of the eastern wall were compromised. Mongol sappers advanced under cover, widening breaches. Abbasid defenders fought with determination in localized clashes, but they lacked reserves to mount counterattacks. Each loss of ground became permanent. The siege had entered its final phase. Hulagu had not rushed the assault. He allowed inevitability to set in. His objective was not merely capture, but demonstration, a warning to every power in the region. Baghdad, the symbolic heart of the Islamic world, was being methodically dismantled, and within its walls, centuries of accumulated prestige were about to meet the full weight of Mongol war doctrine. The collapse would not come in a single dramatic moment. It would unfold through exhaustion, isolation, and leadership failure, until the illusion of invulnerability finally shattered. By the time the Mongol siege lines fully closed around Baghdad, the imbalance between the two forces had become undeniable. Hulagu Khan did not rely on numerical superiority alone. He commanded an army refined by decades of cumulative experience across continents. These were not tribal raiders driven by impulse. They were organized under a decimal system command, units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, each officer accountable, each soldier conditioned to respond instantly to signal flags, drums, and horns. Discipline was not merely enforced, it was embedded. Many of these men had campaigned from the mountains of China to the plains of Hungary. They had faced fortified cities before. They had broken them before. And they understood that siege warfare was less about fury than about patience. The Mongol corps consisted heavily in lightly armored cavalry, each rider typically maintaining multiple horses to ensure endurance and mobility. Even during a static siege, mobility mattered. Patrols constantly circled the perimeter, preventing escape, intercepting messengers, and projecting an image of omnipresent control. Composite bows, crafted from layers of horn and sinew, could penetrate armor at distances that stunned opponents unfamiliar with their range. Every cavalryman was trained to fire accurately at full gallop, But during the siege, many dismounted to serve in coordinated archery lines that suppressed defenders on the walls. Supporting them were contingents of engineers and artillery specialists drawn from conquered territories, Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian experts who understood traction trebuchets, counterweight engines, incendiary mixtures, and the mathematics of angle and force. Hulagu's army was multinational, but command authority remained unmistakably Mongol. Opposing them, Baghdad defenders were a fractured reflection of an empire long past its military zenith. The Abbasid army once commanded formidable Turkish Mamluk regiments and provincial levies capable of defending vast frontiers. By 1258, that institutional strength had eroded. Financial strain, internal politics, and complacency had hollowed the standing forces. The field army that marched out to confront Hulagu had already been destroyed in the opening encounters north of the city. What remained inside the walls were garrison troops, palace guards, hastily armed volunteers, and segments of the population pressed into service. Many were brave, but bravery without coordination is fragile under systematic assault. Command structure inside the city suffered from overlapping authority between civil administrators, military officers, and the caliph's personal advisors. No single battlefield commander exercised undisputed control over the defense. The physical environment of Baghdad both aided and betrayed its inhabitants. The city lay on both banks of the Tigris River, protected by walls that had once symbolized Abbasid power. Canals branched outward, feeding agriculture and commerce. In theory, these waterways could serve defensive purposes. In practice, Mongol engineers manipulated them. By breaching dikes and redirecting channels, they created flooded zones that trapped retreating defenders and complicated internal movement. The winter season added further strain. Cold winds swept across Mesopotamia's plains, carrying dust and smoke from bombardment. Mud formed around the outer defensive works, slowing repair efforts and exhausting laborers who worked under arrow fire to shore up damaged sections. Hulagu positioned his forces deliberately. One wing established control of the eastern approaches, constructing siege batteries within range of the walls. Another secured the western bank of the Tigris, ensuring that no relief force could approach undetected. Pontoon bridges and controlled crossings allowed Mongol units to coordinate across both sides of the river. The encirclement was complete, but it was not chaotic. Supply caravans flowed steadily from rear depots. Herds of livestock accompanied the army, providing fresh meat. The Mongol logistical system, dependent on mobility and decentralized provisioning, functioned even during prolonged operations. Hunger and disorganization, common afflictions of besieging armies in earlier centuries, did not cripple Hulagu's campaign. The bombardment intensified with calculated rhythm. Massive stones arced over the walls, smashing into towers and collapsing sections that had not been reinforced for generations. Fire projectiles ignited wooden structures inside residential quarters. Smoke rose above the skyline, visible from every district. For civilians, the psychological weight was immense. Baghdad had not endured such a concentrated assault in living memory. Markets closed. Families crowded into interior courtyards, seeking relative shelter from falling debris. Mosques filled with prayer. But even as sermons invoked endurance, the physical evidence of vulnerability grew harder to deny. On the walls, defenders struggled with fatigue. Repair crews attempted to patch breaches with timber and rubble, only to see their work undone by the next volley. Archers returned fire, but their range and accuracy could not match the coordinated suppression from Mongol bowmen positioned behind mantlets and protective screens. When Abbasid units attempted sorties to disrupt siege engines, they faced disciplined counterattacks. Mongol cavalry would feign withdrawal, drawing attackers into exposed ground before encircling them with speed that seemed almost mechanical. Each failed sortie reduced the pool of experienced defenders. Inside the city, rumors amplified defeat. Some claimed reinforcements were marching from Syria or Egypt. Others whispered that no help would come. Leadership tensions sharpened as options narrowed. Caliph al-Mustasim faced competing counsel. Some advisors urged immediate surrender to preserve the population. Others insisted that capitulation would invite humiliation and possibly execution regardless. The caliph's authority, once unquestioned in ceremonial matters, proved less decisive under existential threat. Messages were exchanged with Hulagu, but Mongol terms hardened with each passing day. Submission without resistance might once have secured leniency. After open battle and prolonged defiance, the calculus had changed. Hulagu sought not merely compliance but demonstration, a signal to every polity observing from afar that refusal carried irreversible consequences. Within the Mongol camp, morale remained steady. Siege operations were methodical rather than frenzied. Engineers adjusted trajectories, tested counterweight calibrations, and coordinated timing to concentrate fire on selected wall segments. Intelligence gathered from defectors and captured prisoners informed assault planning. Hulagu's command tent functioned as the operational center, where reports flowed continuously. Wall integrity assessments, casualty counts, supply inventories. Decisions followed analysis, not impulse. When a breach widened sufficiently on the eastern side, preparations for storming began quietly, without theatrical display. The defenders sense a shift. Breaches represent more than physical gaps. They mark psychological thresholds. Once attackers can see into the streets beyond, once defenders must fight not atop walls but within narrow alleys, the nature of resistance transforms. Urban combat favors those with coordination and numerical superiority. Baghdad possessed winding streets and dense construction that could, in theory, slow invaders. But such defense requires centralized command and disciplined unit cohesion. The Abbasid forces lacked both. Militias were tied to neighborhoods, loyal to local leaders, rather than a unified operational plan. As February advanced, continuous bombardment eroded entire sections of fortification. Dust clouds hung over the eastern district. Mongol drums signaled readiness. Archers intensified suppressive fire, while shielded infantry advanced toward the primary breach. Defenders met them with desperate resistance, hurling stones, firing arrows, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. For hours, fighting surged back and forth across the rubble-strewn gap. Yet Mongol reserves waited in depth. When frontline units tired, fresh contingents replaced them seamlessly. Abbasid defenders, by contrast, had no structured rotation. Exhaustion accumulated without relief. Gradually, Mongol troops established a foothold inside the wall. Once internal gates were opened from within, cavalry elements poured into outer districts. The defensive perimeter fractured into isolated pockets. Communication between sectors collapsed. Smoke, screams, and the thunder of hooves echoed through streets that had once hosted scholars and merchants. Some defenders retreated toward the Caliphate Palace complex, forming improvised last stands. Others discarded weapons and attempted to blend into the civilian population. The distinction between soldier and civilian blurred amid chaos. Hulagu did not immediately order indiscriminate destruction. Initial objectives centered on securing control points, bridges, administrative centers, arsenals. Yet resistance in scattered quarters trigger harsh reprisals. Mongol doctrine emphasized deterrence through overwhelming response. News of each executed commander, each subdued district, spread quickly, accelerating surrender in some sectors while hardening fatalistic defiance in others. By mid-February, organized resistance had effectively disintegrated. The siege phase had transitioned into occupation. But the tension did not dissipate. The Caliph remained inside the city, his fate unresolved. Hulagu demanded his surrender in person. With no army left to command and no relief force on the horizon, Al-Mustasim faced the irreversible consequences of earlier hesitation. The world he represented, a caliphate that once directed vast territories, had narrowed to a surrounded palace within a conquered capital. Outside its walls stood an empire forged in mobility and iron discipline, prepared to demonstrate what defiance ultimately cost. The final decisions now awaited not on the battlefield, but in a confrontation between symbolic authority and uncompromising power. By mid-February 1258, Baghdad's defenses had been systematically breached, and the once mighty city teetered on the brink of annihilation. The Mongol army, methodical and relentless, had already demonstrated that walls alone could not withstand the combined mastery of engineering, cavalry maneuver, and psychological warfare. Within the remaining sections of the city, a grim calculus gripped those in authority. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, had been reduced to a figure of ceremonial authority, his advisors offering conflicting guidance. Some urged negotiation, advocating immediate submission to preserve lives and retain some vestige of political legitimacy. Others argued that any surrender would be interpreted as weakness, risking dishonor and potential execution. In the chaos, his own resolve faltered. Days of bombardment, the collapse of coordinated defense, and the psychological terror of witnessing Mongol discipline in action had corroded confidence. Baghdad, the symbolic center of the Islamic world, stood vulnerable not merely in stone, but in will. Hulagu's strategy had always relied on this psychological dimension. His intent was not simply to take Baghdad, but to eliminate it as a symbol of resistance and to demonstrate the consequences of defiance to the broader Islamic world. Mongol doctrine viewed cities as instruments. Resistance invited total destruction. Submission offered life at a price. The terms were clear and the logic brutal. The caliph's hesitancy had already removed the possibility of mercy. The Mongols had observed the city's failed sorties and piecemeal counterattacks, the fractured command, and the inability of local forces to coordinate. From their perspective, this was not merely a military victory in progress. It was a moral demonstration. Every stone fired, every breach widened, served as evidence of the futility of resistance. Within the walls, defenders understood that the collapse was not just physical, but existential. Fear was now as potent a weapon as trebuchet or bow. When the Mongols prepared to enter the city, they did so with disciplined method. The primary breaches in the eastern and northern walls became conduits for coordinated cavalry and infantry assaults. Mongol engineers led the vanguard, clearing debris, suppressing resistance, and facilitating the entry of mounted units. Streets that had once carried merchants, scholars, and students became funnels of confrontation. Defenders, though desperate, were few and fragmented. Urban combat, with its narrow alleyways and dense construction, normally favors defenders. However, the lack of unified command and insufficient manpower rendered such advantages moot. Mongol forces, accustomed to siege and city assault, moved systematically, securing strong points and advancing in echelon. Each sector of the city was contained, preventing coordinated counterattacks and ensuring that pockets of resistance could be neutralized sequentially. Within the city, panic spread rapidly among civilians. Families fled toward central districts, toward palaces, or toward waterways they had hoped would provide escape. The Tigris, manipulated by the Mongol engineers earlier, now functioned as both barrier and trap. Crossing points were controlled, bridges occupied by Mongol troops, and canals flooded to impede movement. In many cases, civilians and exhausted defenders alike became entangled, resulting in chaotic congestion that compounded casualties. The psychological pressure was magnified by the constant roar of siege engines, the smoke of burning neighborhoods, and the relentless percussion of Mongol coordination. Even those removed from frontline combat could not escape the realization that their city was lost, that centuries of accumulated culture and political authority were unraveling within hours. The palace complex, where the caliph resided, became the final focal point. Al-Musta'sim was now surrounded, his remaining guards isolated, outnumbered, and exhausted. Hulagu demanded his personal surrender, emphasizing both the inevitability and the consequences of continued defiance. The caliph, having witnessed the collapse of the outer defenses and the disintegration of his military forces, faced a stark choice: surrender and hope for clemency, or resist and risk total destruction. Historically, this moment has been interpreted variously as a mixture of indecision, pride, and desperation, whether out of fear of losing honor, an underestimation of Mongol ruthlessness, or internal political considerations. The caliph hesitated long enough for Hulagu to act decisively. Hulagu's forces moved in systematically. The remaining defenders of the palace, unable to coordinate effectively, were overwhelmed in a combination of mounted assault and infantry insertion. Mongol soldiers, disciplined and trained for close combat, cleared interior spaces with methodical precision. Archers suppressed any resistance, while engineers maintained control of internal choke points. Reports of attempted negotiation or surrender were either ignored or delayed until final security was ensured. The caliph was captured. Historical accounts suggest he was confined and later executed, marking the symbolic end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a ruling institution. This was not merely a political event, but a psychological one. signaling to all contemporaneous Muslim states that traditional centers of authority could be destroyed irreversibly. The immediate aftermath within Baghdad was catastrophic. Contemporary chroniclers describe widespread slaughter, particularly targeting the remaining soldiers, bureaucrats, and members of elite households. Civilians were not spared. Indiscriminate killing, looting, and arson transformed neighborhoods into ruins. Libraries, mosques, and administrative archives were destroyed, with some sources claiming that the Tigris ran black with ink from discarded manuscripts. The destruction of Baghdad's intellectual infrastructure was particularly consequential, extinguishing centuries of accumulated scholarship in philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and literature. The Mongols were methodical in targeting symbols of centralized authority, both military and cultural, ensuring that the city could not serve as a functional center for resistance or governance in the immediate future. Beyond the physical devastation, the psychological imprint was enduring. Survivors recounted not only the horrors of battle and occupation, but also the calculated efficiency of the Mongol campaign. Hulagu's army did not merely overwhelm. It demonstrated the structural fragility of cities and empires reliant on symbolic authority, weak military coordination, and indecisive leadership. This lesson reverberated across the Middle East. States previously confident in their autonomy now confronted the tangible evidence that even the most venerable institutions could collapse swiftly under disciplined, technologically adaptive, and psychologically sophisticated adversaries. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the unifying institution of the Islamic world, ceased to function as a political authority. Future Abbasids existed only as ceremonial figures under Mamluk protection in Cairo, devoid of temporal power. Strategically, the fall of Baghdad reshaped the balance of power across the region. The Mongols secured control over Mesopotamia and extended their influence towards Syria, leaving states such as the Ayyubids and later Mamluks to confront the prospect of Mongol expansion. Trade routes, previously anchored by Baghdad's role as a hub, were disrupted, while survivors and refugees carried tales of destruction and discipline to neighboring regions. Military tactics observed in this campaign. The integration of siege engineering, mobility, psychological manipulation, and ruthlessness became reference points for subsequent confrontations with Mongol forces. Armies that previously relied on fortifications alone realized that defensive preparation without strategic depth, coordinated command, and psychological readiness was insufficient.